Can we do a clap too? Can we do
Sure.
Just so we can? You ready, Paddy?
Wait.
Hang on. We've got a
You
3, 2,
1 go or
3, 2, 1
clap?
Yeah.
Right,
3, 2, 1.
No, all right. This is
Whatever.
not our
It's
game.
close. It was close enough. Welcome, everybody. This is the Dingo Mafia Podcast, the pilot episode, the first episode. I'm so glad to welcome Paddy Steinfort into the studio today. The goal of the Dingo Mafia Podcast really is a selfish pursuit. It's a chance for me to get my Aussie accent back, relate to other Aussies who are doing things on a global scale, whether it's their first career or their second or third iteration of their careers. Part of it is building the Aussie network back up to be able to come and have a beer with Paddy or others when I visit cities around the US and the world. And I'm privileged to have Paddy with me today. I think I actually want to be Paddy when I grow up, if I'm quite honest. The more I'm listening and reading about Paddy's work, it's seriously impressive the way that he's gone about his global career, and really that a part of the Dingo Mafia podcast is Aussies who are making an impact on a global scale. Paddy, we're here in Brooklyn in the US, a long way from the suburbs of Melbourne. Why don't you give me a little bit of a short version of your journey to be here today?
All right. Well, Trav, I appreciate the kind words. I guarantee you that you don't want to be me when you grow up. It's some of my life has been amazing, but there's a lot of stuff that people don't see right along the way.
Yep.
And I guess that's a good short version of the journey of the story of how I end up living in Brooklyn. And I've been here 10 years, not Brooklyn, but been in America 10 years. And for the most part, it was genuinely accidental. At no point was I like, I'm going to go do that thing. I'm going to move to America. It was, I was coaching in AFL, very, very first gig at the Adelaide Crows. Shout out to the South Australian boys. And in order to be better at my job, I was like, I'll study psychology, partly like a CV differentiator, but also I was curious about it. So I would come here every off season and just visit teams, kind of like what you're doing with the podcast, right? Just try and actually build a network and curious, also tax write-off, perfect.
Yep.
And I ran into one of my favorite psych researchers, or at least I was flying into Philly, and I read on the plane over the Pacific that this person is at University of Pennsylvania, which I had no idea where that is. It sounds like it's in where the vampires are from.
Yep.
And but then it said in Philadelphia, and I'm like, oh, what are the odds? Let's see what happens. So I wrote an email to a mutual connection. And by the time I landed in Philly, I had meetings with like 4 or 5 of the best researchers in the world at this university. I went along. They said, you might want to do this course. And I was like, yeah, no worries. So I signed up but deferred because I've still got 2 years on my contract back in Australia. And then that was a very tough year for the Crows for many reasons, one of which being Dean Bailey passing away, which had a knock-on effect to all of the coaches and the players. Sando ends up, Brenton Sanderson loses his job at the end of that season, and I get the opportunity to get a buyout effectively and get paid to come and study. So I'm like, I'll do a year over there, stay wherever I stay, get the degree, and then come back and be a coach again. And then before I'd even finished and got my degree, I was hired with the Philadelphia Eagles in the NFL to do mental conditioning work, kind of translating my research into my coaching in a different football, but the culture's similar. And kind of never looked back. I went from there into Major League Baseball, from there into NBA, and along the way have been lucky enough to have a few clients who are fairly well known now. And that's led to work outside of that with the US Army, Stanford, Madison. Even like I had to pinch myself at one stage. I'm sitting at a table with the chief flight officer of NASA and the guy who trains the Navy SEALs, and just like bonkers level operators. And I'm kind of been a kid in a candy store ever since, just falling into things that I really love doing. They're very challenging, but that's I'm going to stop rambling because that's as short a version as I can give you.
No, I love it. And I think you did skip over a part where, your first career was as an AFL football player. And
sorry.
No, that's fine. And I think, it also goes to speak about, what you've been able to do post-sport. in building a career and building a life here in the US and across the globe, doing incredible things within high performance. And you describe yourself as a high performance coach for people in the biggest arenas, in cutthroat arenas. You know, you mentioned professional sports, you've mentioned military, you've mentioned, I've heard you talk about nurses and doctors. I don't want to dismiss your abilities in that field and in those fields, but I am very curious to hear about how you, being an Australian, maybe helped or even hindered in some of those conversations and the meetings and the opportunities that you got. Do you think it opened more doors than it would have if you were another random American guy? Or did it, who's this Aussie guy who's coming in trying to tell me what to do? I'm from NASA, or I'm, a Super Bowl champion. Tell me a little bit about that and whether or not that helped or hindered you.
Yeah, it's a good question because it's something I noticed early on here purely because people would comment, like I hadn't lost my accent at that point.
Yep.
I know a lot of Americans will tell me I haven't lost my accent, but people in Australia will tell me
I get the same thing.
Every time
I call my mates, they're like, you sound so American.
So when I arrived, I didn't have that. I had the full sharp accent, and so everyone would be like, oh my God, where are you from? And that definitely was a point of difference. But I also noticed there were people getting hired in like all across American sport, mostly in sports science positions. And some of them are world's best, and some of them I was like, how did he get a job here?
Yep.
So there must be something to it, that there's definitely a mystique or an aura around particularly sports science in Australia because of what the AIS did leading into particularly the Sydney Olympics. Maximising and even this previous Olympics in Paris, we've way outperformed what we should.
Yep.
So there's something to what we do, right? And so particularly in sport, people are definitely like, oh, these guys know what they're doing, or at least we get that opportunity. But you buy yourself an extra 10 minutes in an interview, basically.
Right. Yep.
But then beyond that, I think the other part of it you mentioned, being a former player, absolutely helped. Like there was a moment with, I believe it was talking with the NASA and then at the fire department in New York. Actually, we had this ridiculous conglomeration of all these people who do things where if you screw up, someone dies.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there like, oh, I coach millionaire athletes. It's pretty, it's pretty tough compared to what they do, right?
Yep.
But the interesting part was when I made the point about, and this is, I'll bring it back to the AFL thing in a sec. I made the point about, I feel a bit weird sitting here. If your nurse screws up, the patient dies. If you screw up, $1 billion rocket dies. If you screw up, your mate next to you dies in Afghanistan. Like our guys get roasted.
It's not life or death.
Yeah, they get roasted on Twitter.
Right.
And the response from the guy who runs the Navy SEAL training, he goes, yeah, but the human inside doesn't know any different. Whether it's a bullet whistling past your ear or a contract getting torn up in the back of your mind, the fear response, the physiology takeover, and the way it affects your finite skills, your fine motor skills and your decision making and processing is exactly the same. And I was like, wow, that's actually a really profound statement. Plus, it also applies. Like, I know, having worked with military and doctors, they're super curious about how athletes do it because they're the only ones who understand what it's like to, if you play shit today, you lose your job.
Yep.
Or if you, this next 2 hours, once it's started, you can't go back. And not many people have that as their day-to-day job.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a crossover there, and I think that combination for me of I've actually lived in the arena for a bit. I didn't do a very good job, but I did it. Bought me time and open ears from people who aren't like, oh, you're not just you didn't just read books.
Right.
You actually lived it. And probably hurt more than you needed to. So you've learned a bit. But then the other part, the Australian thing is I think similar in that Aussies generally give less fucks. We're allowed to swear on this show?
You can, please.
Good.
It'd be rude not to.
It would be. You probably have to have the C word in every episode once.
Yeah. We'll build up to that.
Yeah. And I think because Aussies give less fucks, that is a point of difference in America where generally deference and saying yes or pleasing the boss is important.
Yep.
Aussies tend to have my boss is the people below me or beside me, unless they're very political animals. which I've discovered you need to be over the course of a career, right? But Australians, particularly as a point of difference in America, are more willing to say that this is bullshit. What are we doing?
Yeah.
We ain't here to F spiders is a saying that doesn't exist here.
Yep.
But it's something that Australians bring to the table.
Yeah. Funny aside, I went to Scotland, play golf with some mates. There was a Scottish guy, an English guy, an Aussie, and an American, and the banter was great. But at one point, I said, "We're not here to fuck spiders," and my American mate thought that was the greatest thing ever. He'll text me every couple of months, like just that. Back to that. So I think that. Do you think the ability to speak up for what you believe, or this is bullshit, or call bullshit, comes from our environment, growing up in sporting clubs, or growing up in a society where perhaps you can put your hand up and say, hang on a second, I don't agree with this, more so than what you've seen in American culture per se, or other sports or other organizations that you worked with?
No, I wouldn't. I would actually say it's... So I've been here 10 years.
Yep.
And I almost moved back during the pandemic because I was in charge of the Socceroos and the Matildas for the Tokyo Olympics and the next 2 World Cups. And because of Australia's ridiculous COVID laws, sorry if anyone agrees with them, but I disagreed thoroughly, I was basically locked out of the country and couldn't quite do my job, or couldn't get our players to do the job because we had to play away all the time. That's not the important bit.
Yep.
What I noticed, though, was that Australians have become much more rule-following and abiding by what they're told than what I remember it being. Now, that could just be me being nostalgic about it, but it definitely feels like a different country these days.
Yep.
And I think the difference in people being able to speak up is less about whether that's a normal cultural thing. It's part of it. But I think the power dynamics play a lot into it, because sporting clubs, I worked in sporting clubs in Australia, and there were many times when some of the most powerful players or coaches or staff would have a little sidebar chat about, gee, like, what are we going to do about that? I'm like, well, you could have just said that in the meeting. Like, so it's not necessarily an Australian thing or a sporting thing. Those guys still struggle to do it in the wrong instances, or where the cost might outweigh the benefit.
Right. So it's a human thing rather than
absolutely,
a cultural thing.
Yeah. Human and particularly human and I would say sociological or social psychology issue is that when there is a power dynamic or a power differential, I have to weigh in, like, what is it going to cost me to make this statement? Is it worth paying that cost? And if I'm super, a sacrificial lamb, I'll say it even though it might cost me my job.
Right.
I have to be incredibly secure or stupid to do that. And if I'm not secure financially or personally, then it isn't happening because of the potential cost. So I think Australians, the other thing that happened for me absolutely as an Australian over here was it's a free shot. Like it's like walking into a Monopoly game halfway through and being like, oh, I'll have one lap, and if I go to jail, I go to jail.
Right.
I don't want to go to jail, but if I go bankrupt, I go bankrupt, and I go back to Australia and everything's fine.
Yeah.
Right. And you'll still be able to walk back to Australia and everyone will be like, oh, you were in America for a couple of years. Good stuff, man. Well done.
Yeah.
So I think there's an element of that takes away some of the potential cost. We have a couple of free swings, and I luckily connected with a few of mine, and also someone asked me the other day, how'd you end up? Yeah, same sort of question you asked. And my initial answer, part tongue in cheek, but in reality it's true, is I sent one more email. Like, I just kept asking questions, and you just do stuff because you might as well. So let's see what happens. Yep. And I think that's, I feel like that is traditionally part of the Aussie spirit. Have a crack, give it a go.
Yep.
And that definitely helped. Like my job at the Eagles came about because I'd already sent them some data. I'd met them briefly. I spoke again, and then there was nothing for like 2 or 3 months. And I could have at that point just said, oh, well, I'm not going to work with the Eagles. Yep. I was like, no, fuck it, send another email. Like, they might have been busy planning their training camp, and that's what it was.
And now you're on the other side of it. You know that they were busy, and that there was a reason to it.
Absolutely.
And I think for me, and I mentioned how selfish this was in the beginning, I think the last 2.5 years for me have been, quite difficult. I mean, been through a divorce and, career changes and, COVID and the backside of COVID. And I think part of this for me is a bias for action, where the last couple of years it's been a bias towards inaction, a fear of what will people say or what will people think, or this is what the trajectory that I was on, and now I'm on a different trajectory. So part of this is a bias for action, and sending one more email or sending the pitch to one more person who says, yeah, that's a good idea, you should do it, you should meet this person.
Yeah.
So yeah, selfishly, this is part of the reason why I'm pursuing this, is because I just want to fucking get moving and I want to get rolling again.
Well, I think that there's absolutely power to that. And even like, I'll use the podcast as an example, right? Dingo Mafia is going to be great. I'm looking forward to the 100th episode down the track. I'll come back for that.
Yep.
I stumbled in, again, an accidental thing, stumbled into doing a podcast for the US Army during COVID, purely because I was on this advisory board, which was more of a research and development thing, right? I had a couple of things. They were like, what can we do while everyone's locked away? I'm like, well, I've got these interviews we did at the 76ers. I've recorded them. Let me get them cleared and I'll share them with you. People might benefit. And there was great feedback, and they were like, can you do any more? And I hit up a few people who were kind of famous but open to it. And then it just really rolled from there. It ends up being like top 5% in the world or something. It's pretty stupid.
Yep.
But only because it was just like, fuck it, I'm going to do it. And I don't care if anyone thinks it's stupid. I'm doing it for a good reason.
Yep.
It's for a legitimate community. And if it grows beyond that, great. And that, I think, also comes from, when you're fresh here, that free swing mentality means that you can usually send another one or do a random podcast episode and release it. And if it doesn't work, the tall poppy thing that would haunt you back in Australia doesn't haunt you because you're separated enough.
Yep.
You can swing and miss enough here without thinking what people will think about you the next day.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, so I have a couple of things there. I actually love the episode you did with Shaq.
Yeah.
And I, as I was preparing, I was thinking about all the people that you've been able to meet along your journey, and whether or not you get starstruck in moments like that where you're recording a podcast with Shaq, or you're working with some of the most famous NFL or NBA or MLB players and coaches. Have you ever had moments where you kind of sit back and you're like, holy shit, I'm in this room with X, I'm nervous, or I feel starstruck, or how did I get here?
I always say this to players, everyone now who's a client outside of sport as well. Like, if you don't get nervous before you're doing something, there's something a little bit wrong. Like, you've lost your edge. Like, it doesn't mean enough to you now.
Good. So I'm okay to be nervous.
Yeah,
good.
Absolutely.
Good.
Absolutely. Right. There should be some sense of, I've got to be on here. Like, there's a great interview with, I can't remember the name of the guy, but he was a Red Bull wingsuit base jumper. And he would hurl himself off cliffs and fly through gaps that are only about this wide in mountain structures with no parachute and just winging it, literally. And they asked him, how are you so fearless? And he's like, no, I'm not fearless. I go, but you jump. You have to get rid of your fear to be able to do that. He's like, hell no. Like, if I'm not nervous, I don't jump.
Right.
Because the fear makes me double check my equipment, makes me triple check my flight path. Like, then I'm really dialed in. So it's actually helpful, right? How do we get onto that? You can cut me asking that. I've rambled a little bit. How do we get onto that?
So I was asking whether or not you get starstruck or felt like you were in a room and wondered how you got there.
Yeah. So nerves as sessions get started, I feel like they're normal. They're not like I'm shitting myself and I'm sweaty and heart's pounding.
Yep.
And I reckon my first session with Texas Tech football was like that, and definitely my first Eagles session. But at that point, the Eagles thing, I was just in over my head being like, fuck it, just do it and see what happens. And I rolled day to day, like 40 days in a row. It was pretty ridiculous, what was being asked of me as a coach. But I almost couldn't think about it too much. I just had to get another session done. So yeah, at that stage, that was my first year or second year here, and there was a little bit of that. But by the time I was in the NBA, I'd been around enough. Like, I'd spent 2.5, 3 years in Major League Baseball, which is a grind and a half. And at that point, I knew I'm walking around with people who are worth more than all of Australian sport combined, right? Individuals,
yeah.
And I couldn't give a shit at that point. Like, I've had enough. Are you going to talk or not? Like, are you going to do what we're talking about or not? Like, it's just become, I'm just here to help.
Yep.
And it doesn't matter who you are. And so by the time I got to the NBA, yes, I worked with some superstars, number of number one draft picks, a future MVP, previous rookie of the year, all-stars, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
And that was less of a thing for me. There was a moment there, though, with the 76ers. The reason I'm mentioning it is because there was a pinch myself moment a few years earlier when I was at the Blue Jays, Toronto. My brother was coming through doing a story on Ben Simmons because my brother's a reporter for, at that stage, 60 Minutes.
Yep.
He was doing a story on Ben, and this is before I ever knew I was going to work with Ben. And so he's like, I'm going to be in New York on this date to record the Sixers at Madison Square Garden. Are you any chance of being around? I'm like, I'll be sick that day.
I'll be there.
Yeah. So I sorry to my Blue Jays employers, but
in in Australia, we call that chuck a sickie.
I chucked a sickie for a couple of days, made my way back to New York, which is where I was actually living at the time. So technically I was right to go home. And we were courtside while they were warming up, and I was starstruck at that point. I'm like, how good's this? And I feel just personally, I felt much more at home in the culture of basketball than the culture of baseball. And just being around that, I was like, oh, I liked this. So we go upstairs. We're in like absolute nosebleeds on the roof of Madison Square Garden. Can barely see these little ant-sized players on the court. But we grab a beer and we're sitting there and we're like, how funny is this, mate? Like, you and me in America, you're killing it, what you're doing, I'm going okay. And I'm like, yeah, and I think I'm going to work here. I'm going to work in basketball. I don't know what it was, but I was at Madison Square Garden, blah, blah, blah. And then fast forward, it might have been the exact same date or somewhere very close 3 years later. I'm on court warming up Joel Embiid at Madison Square Garden being like, oh, fuck. I remember last time I was here at the Sixers.
Sitting up there, I'm in a different view right now.
There. It was a little bit different. Joel Embiid was backing me down and dunking on me, so it was a different story.
That's amazing, mate. Does that resonate to you, or do you think about manifestation? Is that something that's played a part in your journey where you have that moment, you're like, I'm going to work here? Did you believe that in the moment, or was it just something that you kind of said on a whim and didn't really come back to it? Or do you actually really believe in that concept of manifestation?
It's a mixed answer. I will say I don't believe in the concept of, think it into existence. Right. I thought so hard about being a good AFL player, and I never got to be. Right. So, and I did everything. I visualised, I was positive, I did all of the old tricks that they teach you in psychology that don't actually work. Right. Which is part of what drove me to be like, okay, what does work? Mm-hmm. So I don't believe in that positive thinking approach. I do believe, though, there is some power in being like, I'd like to do that. Now, let's just do, it kind of guides your future decisions of me signing up to the course in America. I'm like, I might come back, but I'll defer for a year because I can't do it right now. But let's
revisit it at some point.
Little dog-ear the page, right? Yep. And working in the NBA, when a recruiter approaches me while I've got an extension on the table from the Blue Jays, there's no need for me to move besides the fact that lifestyle in baseball is horrific. And they're like, oh, we've got an opportunity. It's outside of this sport, though. And I'm like,
tell me more.
Tell me the sport. And it's NBA. I'm like, well, of course, I'll go through whatever hoops you want me to jump because I wouldn't mind that, right? And then there's another time where someone said, could you ever move back to Australia? We joked like there might be only one or two jobs that I could take. One would be Cricket Australia. The other one would be the Socceroos. And then the Socceroos thing comes on the table. Now there's no way I spoke those into existence.
Right.
But I do know that if you've got some idea of like, I'd like to end up there, you're more likely to make little decisions or put a bit of extra effort into something that might get you there.
Yep. I want to go back to that because I think it's really interesting to think about, once again, the bias fraction and progress and the journey along those ways. It's not really about the final destination. It is what are you doing day to day to get to those points where you can have those conversations about can you go to the NBA or Soccer Australia. But I want to go back to working with superstars. Mm-hmm. Do you get more joy from your work or fulfillment in supporting the superstar in continuing to be the superstar, or do you get more fulfillment from the guy or girl who is on the verge of a career, on the edge of making it, and seeing them have more success and grow in their career? Which one do you think you get more fulfillment from?
It's a bit, it's a mixed picture because to me it's more about the delta, right? What difference have you actually made? Right. Where if someone's already killing it and they've already made 400 mil and they're going to make an extra 20 mil, like, cool. But if someone is on zero and they end up getting a career of 13 mil, then his life and his kid's life are different forever. And I have thought about that particularly. I don't think there's much difference. It's more, to be honest, it's actually more working with people who value the work and do the work. So Raheem Mostert, who is now well known in the NFL, he holds a number of NFL records, was undrafted and turned up to Philly the same time I did. He was actually literally the first athlete I sat down with. He's undrafted. He's gone through some shit that he's spoken about publicly now, but at that stage, no one knew except me and people in his circle.
Yep.
And we worked through pre-season, and at that he ended up getting cut anyway. He led the NFL for rushing yards per carry in the pre-season, but the Eagles had no room. They had 3 All-Stars in the running backs room, so he got punted. He jumped around, bounced around from team to team, got cut a number of times, ends up at San Francisco, plays well enough there to cement a spot when 3 other people are injured, effectively carries the team, scores 4 touchdowns in the conference champ, carries him into a Super Bowl. He's made it.
Yep.
Bank the next contract. Happy days. And I'm super stoked for him. I know that some of what we worked through definitely helped him at least hang in there, but I just assume that some of it stayed with him because he makes a couple of comments in post-match interviews, post-game interviews that I'm like, oh, that sounds familiar.
Got your fingerprint on that.
Yeah, a little bit. But that's also me being like, don't be so arrogant. Come on.
Yep.
It's been 4, 5, 6 years at that point. And then he comes on as, he might have been the first episode. He wasn't the first call I had, but first guest on the podcast. And he openly says, yeah, man, I still have the journal. Like I was looking at it as I was getting ready for training camp right now. Like the stuff that we did, your exercises definitely helped me. I know that, you know, the concept of working, riding the waves and being able to deal with what's coming up, like it definitely has helped me and served me all the way. And I want to say a big thank you to him. You know, and at that point, I'm like, you know, even right now, I'm getting goosebumps. And that's a kid who went from zero. I think his latest contract will take him over 14 mil US career earnings. So that's huge.
Yep.
And then at the same time as that was happening, I was flying to Texas and working with a kid who would eventually make 13 mil standing up. Like he would make 13 mil if he didn't turn up to work in the next month, probably. And that is very satisfying, again, because 7 years down the track, he comments that, yes, that stuff helped and I still use it.
Yeah. Multiple MVP, Super Bowl champ.
He's won a few Super Bowls, a few MVPs, and I don't like dropping his name, but in the question of do you like helping the guy with zero or the guy who's actually kind of set up? Now at that point, Pat wasn't fully set up, so he still was coming from way back.
But did you know at that time that he was going to be something special in that work?
No chance.
Really.
And I think that was, the coach, so Cliff Kingsbury, who ends up being the coach of the Cardinals for a bit, he's OC at Washington now. Very, very cool dude, very open and values this stuff. He was a quarterback back up to Brady for a few years himself, so he knows the importance of it. And he and the athletic director there, Kenny Bell, who's now still with the Cardinals, were tremendous in the way they were, open to what I'm like, I think we should do this. And like, cool, let's do it. But also in facilitating and getting to the key players who they wanted in the program to feed them in. One of which was Patrick. And Cliff said at the time, like, he wasn't the starting quarterback, and we had one player from each position room who would work with me as the leader, and then we'd trickle it down. And so at that stage, Davis Webb, who ends up going to the Giants, is the starting quarterback, and Patrick's the backup. And he's like, yeah, but I want you to do both the quarterbacks because Patrick's like, he's just got something. There's going to he's only got one offer. So it's not like it's, at this stage, it still could be hit and miss. But Cliff knew something. And at that point, I was just like, just turn up and do the work. Like, you're not here to work with famous people. It might happen, but just see what happens. And then because I was willing to fly to Lubbock, Texas, which is not easy to get to, and Texas Tech is not a sexy school. It's not like University of Texas or Alabama or whatever. But I was just like, and I had no need to do the work. I'd already got the buyout from the AFL contract. I was just like, just go do it, see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was, if you're going to ascribe something to Australians, I would like to think that we're not a lazy bunch. And that if there's something to be done that isn't, it's not going to be too taxing, and it's a bit of an adventure and, give it a crack. It's kind of what I ended up doing. And that, led to my most famous client, But getting back to your question of what do I enjoy the most, it's really just where you make an impact, because I've now been in a position where I walk in and there's guys in the room who are already Rookie of the Year, or who are already, when I turned up at the Red Sox, there was multiple-time World Series champs there, and just being able to help one of them while shit's falling apart is still just as gratifying. If I actually use a baseball analogy when I'm talking to people about it, the role that I've filled here, maybe not so much with the Socceroos and the Matildas, but the role that I fill here in America for my clients is kind of like a closer in baseball. So for those Aussies who don't know, there's a starting pitcher who normally runs about half the game. Then they just bring in a new pitcher per inning almost, or maybe a couple of innings, depending on how good or bad they throw. But if it's close at the end of the 8th inning and you're going into the 9th, they will bring in a guy who's called the closer. He's their best reliever who can only do short stints, but he's the most reliable if you need to punch out 1, 2, 3 and keep the lead or minimise them extending the lead, then you bring in the closer. And to me, that is kind of what has evolved with my work. Is I don't necessarily have to coach people every day, and I sometimes will be around for quite a while before a fire starts burning, and I'm not there to put out fires. But when push comes to shove, if the guy who's won an MVP or a World Series needs help right now, right here, and you can land that's A, incredibly satisfying, and B, they're like, cool, you can stay in our locker room now.
Yep. Very cool. You talked about earlier the tall poppy syndrome. It's something that I have been thinking about quite a lot. And, growing up in Australia, there was quite a few instances where if you shared what you were trying to do or you're pursuing a big goal, someone would call you a wanker or look at this dickhead, he's, trying a big note or big show. Have you experienced that in Australia in your career? And how has that translated, or has it been different? Would you call it something different in the US or other cultures that you've worked in, or is it a uniquely Australian thing?
I don't think it's uniquely Australian, although we are very overt about the fact that it exists. And I'll come back to the American question shortly. I did experience it in Australia. There are the people who I might mention here might argue that I was just a little shit at the time.
Right.
But I was drafted first round in the AFL to the team that I barracked for as a kid. And so I am absolutely over the moon, like, fucking how good's this? I literally went to my first day of training with the guys' posters still on my bedroom wall, and then I'm kicking the footy with them that day. And it was just surreal.
Yep.
So I'm like, kid in a candy store, literally, I'm still 17 at this point. So I'm walking around like I'm yet to graduate high school. I can be a little bit of a smart ass in class, so I'm a bit of a smart ass. I've been very successful in footy, so I'm pretty comfortable there. And then I'm in a locker room with all these grown men, but I feel like I have a relationship with them already because I've been supporting them for 10 years.
Been watching them, yep.
And also I'm the first round draft pick, so I'm just confident and I'm outgoing. And it gets towards round 1, and Robert Walls, who's the coach at that time, pulls me in. He's like, hey, young fella, like, you're going along okay. Remember, it's a long-term project. You might not play much this first year. But also just, like, try and keep your head down a little bit. I'm like, what do you mean? I'm working hard. I'm vocal at training. He goes, yeah, with the vocal thing, just maybe dial it back a little bit in meetings, training, whatever. I'm like, oh, okay, that used to be a strength of mine. He's like, well, one of the veterans said he wants to put his knee in your neck. So, maybe just pull your head in a little bit. And this was me just, A, living my dream, but also being like, it would be little comments like, we'd finish a set in the gym, I'd look out the window and see a BMW rolling past. I'm like, oh, I'm going to drive one of them in a couple of years. And the people around me are like, fuck, you are.
Yeah.
And that's it's not a great thing to hear, but it's not probably anything that people listening, and they're like, oh, I've had that at my job, or I've had that in my footy club, right?
Yep.
The fact that we've got a name for it is probably a little more Australian than I'm sure it exists over here in competitive environments. In fact, I know it does in like a hedge fund. The trading desks or the portfolio managers are very much like it's because people think there are limited resources, which in a hedge fund there is. There's only so many millions that are spread across the company that we can invest.
Yep. And
if you get my millions, I don't get a profit. So my wife and kids are going hungry, or I don't get the Christmas bonus and I don't get to go to Mallorca.
Yep.
So when you get ahead, I'm going to try and chop you down. right? And I think that comes historically in Australia, that resources weren't that free-flowing, and generally Aussies did it pretty tough early on, definitely, and also, well into the war and past, the World War, middle of last century.
Yep.
That Australians generally like, hey, don't get too fucking far ahead because you got to look after the rest of us as well.
Did that impact the way that you showed up then? Obviously, if hearing potentially some of your heroes saying they want to put their knee in your neck or, knock your block off or whatever it was, did that impact the way that you showed up the next day and ongoing, or did you kind of let it roll off the back and keep going the way that you were going?
No, definitely. For me, it definitely impacted it. And it was probably, I would have preferred now that in retrospect, it would have been great to go to a club that I wasn't already a fan of, because if that had happened somewhere else where I wasn't already in love with stuff, I would have said, well, fuck you guys. There would have been more chance of me wanting to walk. And I actually had a 3-year deal on the table from Collingwood after my first contract. And I was like, no, I'm good. I've fit in. I finally fit in at Richmond. I'm staying.
Yep.
Stupidest move I ever made for a 1-year deal. And so that is, I showed up more muted. I started drinking more to fit in. I was doing stuff that I would look back and say, that's not how I was raised, and that's disappointing. But it was me trying to fit into a group that I was desperate to be a part of, because that was required for me to achieve my dream, which is not the case. I could have gone to another team and achieved my dream. And, I was open about the fact that I wanted to win the Brownlow. I wanted to be the best player in my position. That's not a bad thing to want.
Yep.
But apparently it was. And
right.
So, whereas if you're a first round pick and you're brave enough to say that in America, everyone's like, fuck yeah, go get it.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it exists here as much, because there's actually a bent towards self-promotion, partly because it's required in some ways, in some industries. But it still exists in certain environments where resources are scarce. You can't get too far ahead because you're going to fuck everyone else.
That is so. I'm going to have to remember where it came from, and I will at some point. But I have heard someone talk about the differences, and you mentioned the BMW and the car. That in Australia, if someone saw a nice car, they're going to walk by it with a key and scratch it. And in America or other cultures, they'll see the nice car and they say, that's awesome, man. Good job for you. Well done. How can I?
Yeah, what did you do?
What did you do? How can I do that? The funnier side that you kind of talk about the BMW, but did you get the BMW?
I didn't.
You didn't?
No, I had a Ford Falcon at that point. White Lightning.
Shout out to Ford Falcons. That was one of my first cars too.
Fucking hell, what a terrible shitbox that was. Blew a gasket in first year. I didn't know you had to put water in a car. This is how fucking naive I was. As a
you have to put water in a car?
Yeah, well, at 40 degrees during summer in Melbourne, yes. So anyway, that place was never, that car was never the same again, but I drove that into the ground before I ended up moving to Adelaide, and I got a Holden over there. I never got a fancy car in Australia. Yep. And now I've been in America, I don't have a car.
You don't have a car. Yeah. Well, if BMW is watching, Paddy needs a car. So
that I can park on the street for a ridiculous amount and get keyed in Brooklyn.
I love it. So I think in closing, mate, I think I'd love to do this again at some point once we get to 100 episodes, because I think there's a lot we didn't cover. But I have been having conversations recently about Aussies who seem to be doing well on a global scale. And obviously this is what the podcast is about. If you had to sum up what you think it is about Australians that have allowed yourself and others to really progress in their careers, is there something cultural? Is there something about growing up in Australia? Was there something about the work ethic that we have, or the hard times we've been through? Is there something cultural that you think we bring to the table that has allowed yourself and others to thrive on a global scale?
Yeah. So I think some of the stuff we mentioned before around giving something a crack, the fact that we're separated from Australia here, so you can do things that might be a bit embarrassing and no one's going to find out if you have a crack and fall on your face. And I think the authenticity or the openness of, we don't bullshit, we don't sugarcoat too much. Generally what you see is what you get. I think that helps. There's probably some charm in the accent depending on what city you're in. I know it's worn out in New York and LA, that's for sure, but other cities probably still goes okay. But I also think there's, talking about that resource scarcity before, I actually think growing up in Australia when we were kids, I know you're not my age, are you?
Close, I think.
How old?
42.
Okay, so not my age, but close. Growing up when we were kids, generally life was okay, right? There's no extreme poverty like there is in America. There's definitely not the extreme wealth either, but everyone's just like okay, if not good. And that then leads to people being willing to take chances, and people generally treating people like it's not a fight and you're not a movable asset. Like things aren't objects related to money, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed it in Australia, particularly within sport, but even in business, people are generally like Aussies are they're just nice. They're good fun.
Yeah.
Generally because people aren't means to an end for Australians. They're like, oh, he's a good bloke. That's an important part of being an Australian is as long as you're a good bloke, then you'll be all right. So I feel like wherever that fits in, and girls can be good blokes too for those who aren't Australians, that's probably the most random wandering answer you will ever get to that on the podcast, but it's my
good.
best
It's
shot.
the first one, so it can go up or down from here. One story, and I think this started as a seed of an idea for the Dingo Mafia podcast is, and I know you don't like to name drop it, but I'll drop a couple. I was having a conversation with Dan Churchill. I don't know if you've met Dan. You know Dan. He's a good bloke. And I was talking to Dan about all the projects that he's working on and the things that he's got going on. And he was just as curious about what I was doing and, my background and my history and the things that I was working on as I was with his. And that was the start of the seed of like any opportunity that I can to help a fellow Aussie, and I'm sure you're the same, I'm going to take it. I'm going to make the introduction. I'm going to, call on you when I need help. You're going to call on me when you need help, and vice versa, and other folks along the way. Do you think there's something like that, or talk to me about how you feel about, it's the extreme networking, or it's the I'm willing to open the door for you or make the introduction for you because you're a good bloke, or I want to see you do well.
Yeah, it definitely exists. Like I actually joke sometimes that we're the most well-off immigrant community ever to arrive in New York.
Yep.
It is a small immigrant community. And I remember, I think I even said this to you on the phone the other day, like when I first arrived here, people were like, oh, you should meet up with this guy. So shout out to Brad Blanks, who absolute Aussie legend, and you should definitely get him on here. He's been here 15 plus years and spent 10 years on New York radio.
Yep.
Now has a house in the Hamptons. He's doing okay.
Right.
But Blanksy is one of the best Aussie blokes. He actually presents on, I think, Channel 9. So some of your listeners will be familiar. Anyway, Brad Blanks is a name that was mentioned to me because he is best mates with my sister-in-law. So the wife of my oldest brother basically grew up next door to him, and they're like this,
Mates,
thick as thieves, right?
Yep.
So when I'm moving to New York, you got to let's connect you with Brad Blanks. I mean, no worries. Like, I didn't come to America to meet Australians.
Yep.
Like, I've got enough Aussie friends. I don't need to be doing that. And so I shunned it and deliberately would not mix with Aussies for the first probably 2 or 3 years.
Yep.
And then eventually, you get America can wear you down sometimes. And also just being with Australians, you're like, oh, this is comfortable. I feel like I'm just sitting at the front bar, or I feel like I'm at mum's kitchen table, like, and you can just talk and there's no pretense, right? Yep. So there's definitely that comfort level. But then the more I was in and around those people, Brad being a great example, there's plenty of others, the more I realised, like, oh, shit, I can help them. Like, I can bring some famous people to their restaurant. Yep. Or I can help connect him to someone I know in LA, in showbiz, or whatever it might be. And vice versa, there's always things that Aussies will help with. And I think it's because there is an element, tongue-in-cheek, but also true, that it's an immigrant community, and all immigrant communities look after other people who are in that community, mostly because of necessity. Because if we don't, you're fucked. You're swimming by yourself. Yep. And so whether that's an Aussie thing, I don't know whether it exists in Cape Town or Glasgow. I know there's a bit of it in London, but I think generally where there's enough Aussies around, if you get connected, most of them will help each other out just because it's like, oh, yeah, we're kind of related, aren't we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we must. Well, people ask me all the time, you must know Bill from Mudgera Bar. Yeah, of course. Yeah, close mate of mine. No, there is an instant camaraderie. It is a comfort level as you described, but you can walk. It's funny, my fiance and I travel quite a bit, and we I can point out Aussies in a bar or a restaurant or certain places. I'm like, that he looks like an Aussie, or she looks like an Aussie.
What's the giveaway?
It's usually the moustache and the flat brim cap and the mullet, but
well, be careful in Williamsburg then, because you think everyone's a fucking Aussie.
Well, they're just trying to assimilate
Yeah,
to
that's
Aussies.
true. That's true.
They'd love to be Aussies. Well, mate, this has been great. I do want to end with some quick-fire questions.
All right.
We're going to run through them fast, hence quick-fire. But we'll go. All right, here we go. Vegemite, yes or no?
Can I expand on them?
Of
Or they have
course.
to be just one-word answers?
No, you can go.
Because
You
as
can do
long
whatever
as
you
you're
want,
doing
Paddy.
it lightly spread
Yep.
with a good dose of butter,
Yep.
perfecto. But when you're in America, people lather it on like it's peanut butter,
Yep.
and that shit will take hairs off your nose.
I've seen plenty of people do it wrong. So, okay, so that's a yes.
It's a yes.
With an
Do
asterisk.
it the right way.
Got it.
Yeah.
Best Australian beach?
Ooh. I'm going to say Jan Juck, only because we've got a house down there. I do know that I like an occasional day at Bondi or Tama. Oh, shit, what am I talking about? Byron Bay.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah,
Paddy.
Sorry, I apologise to my northerners.
I was waiting for that. That, by far, good one. Sydney or Melbourne?
Melbourne.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Smart. Who's an Australian that you look up to?
There's many of them. Brad is one, who I mentioned before, Brad Blanks. Eddie Buckingham, who has killed it in the restaurant game over here. Do you want people who in America or Aussies back in Australia?
Global. Oh, anyone actually.
Sam Kerr. Who else? Oh, there's so many. My dad.
Yep.
My brother. Like Aussies are good. I mean, that's family, but there are Aussies who achieve in many areas of life, and that's not the only reason you look up to them. But to me, it's people who do that and are still fantastic humans. That's even more admirable because you can go well and get off track. Those three names I mentioned have not done that.
Love it. Favorite place in the world to relax?
Byron Bay.
Byron Bay. Love it. What's one Australian habit you've kept while living abroad?
Ooh. Gee whiz. Maybe saying gee whiz.
I love that. This is perfect. We're going to have some quotable quotes and translations.
Yeah.
What does gee whiz mean?
Fuck. I would say, I don't know, wearing flip-flops, you call them here, but that's not, is that a habit? It's just a thing. Maybe.
What do we actually call them, though?
Thongs.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe espresso coffee, but that's not an Australian thing. I don't know.
Well, that's a good segue, actually. What's your go-to coffee order?
Espresso. Mostly because I'm in America and you can't trust them.
Right.
Like anything with milk will get fucked up. So just put it in my veins.
Straight to the veins.
Bypass the mouth.
If you could have dinner with any famous Australian, dead or alive, who would it be?
Ooh.
Actually, famous it's not even important. An Australian, dead or alive, who would it be?
I immediately jumped to Ned Kelly, but I think that's just because he'd have a good yarn. Kathy Freeman. We had the privilege of bringing her in to speak to the Matildas ahead of the Women's World Cup.
Yep.
And the gravitas she brings. So there's another example of someone who's obviously the world's best at what she did. Not only that, she carried a nation. Not only that, she carried a people. Has remained incredibly humble and is just the nicest person. And I only got to spend, a couple of team dinners with her and a little side chat before and after, but I'd love to just chill with her.
More time with her.
Yeah.
Love it. You've worked with a lot of sports organisations as a player.
Can I also add Margot Robbie to the list?
Yep.
I know that she's taken, but
got it.
If anyone out there hears anything different.
Margot might want to come on the show. Maybe we can have
I'm sure she does.
Yeah, one day. You've worked with a lot of sports organisations. You, and I love this. This is one tradition I love about Major League Baseball is when people get put into the Hall of Fame, they get to choose the club that they represent.
Oh yeah.
If you were to choose a club or a team to represent as a Hall of Famer, who would that be?
Wow. It's a great question. My initial thought is Richmond because they drafted me, but didn't go well. I don't know. Let me say the Red Sox just because I like their...
Because the hats.
Yeah.
All right.
Good hat.
Good hat. Good hat. Love it. Boston Red Sox.
Yeah.
Hall of Famer.
And, I don't mind throwing, the Aussie soccer team, but it's not really
Right.
That doesn't count as a franchise, right?
That counts, mate. You make the rules here, Paddy.
Oh, right. Well, shit, in that case, fucking Navy SEALs then.
Oh, I love it. Mate, is there any final thoughts, folks who are maybe a little bit gun shy, feeling like they're suffering from tall poppy syndrome, have big goals and dreams? What advice would you have for someone who may be feeling like they're held back a little?
I'm going to quote the great Jim Steins here. One of the positives of having a shit AFL career was that I ended up doing a bit of work in his Reach Foundation early days because I was injured a lot. And I got to meet with him, and particularly after I got cut, I met with him with full intent of being like, I still want to be you. Like, he was obviously a legend. I still want to be you, and I still think I can, but obviously things aren't going well. What advice would you have for me? Do I try and go back into an AFL team? Do I disappear and go to a state league? Like, what happens? And he simply said this, mainly about my career, but I remember it every time I've gotten to a point of like, oh, will I do this or not? Is he said, well, whatever it is that you're trying to do, think about what the worst possible outcome could be. And if you can live with that, then fucking why would you not do it? And that's it's a great way to look at any opportunities you might have. If I've been approached by a literary agent to write a book.
Yep.
And not one that I'm just doing as a favour for a mate. This is supposed to be a big commercial book. And I was like, fuck, I don't know if I have time for that right now. The last time I wrote a book, it wore me out and blah, 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 blah. And then I remembered, like, fucking just say yes. And if you cancel it halfway through and give them all the money back, then so be it, right? Mm-hmm. And it ends up being a pretty good point of, like, you can always stop once you've started something. You can always turn back. You can always fuck up. It's not really going to be a big problem as long as you're tight with people who love you and you've got other stuff to go do.
Yep, love it. So, one sentence. What's the worst thing that could happen?
As in right now?
No, just that's the
the
quote.
Shit. Yeah, no, that's absolutely
What's
sorry.
The worst
as a good grab for you.
Yeah.
Jim Steins told me that think about the worst thing that could happen, and if you can live with that, go ahead.
Love it. Who would you nominate to join me on the Dingo Mafia podcast?
I mean, Margot Robbie, obviously.
Yeah, well, you have to be in the room for that one.
It'd be a crowded studio in here, I reckon. Who would I nominate? I would actually nominate Brad Blanks or Eddie Buckingham because those are two incredibly high-achieving Aussies who have been here way longer than me and aren't any chance of going home again. They've really established lives and families here.
Yep.
But cracking fellas and spin a good yarn too.
Love it. So I'm gonna get you to make those intros
right now.
Not right now. But I've neglected to do this at the start.
Okay, Call, you're on the line.
Yeah. Come on in. I neglected to do this at the start, so I'm going to do it now. So you can clap again, Walter. I'm going to read the intro that our friend Paul Francis gave us. This is going to be a part of the show. Is the intro. Good. So you've got something to live up to. So the intro goes: Paddy, meet Travis McKenzie. Trav is a little Aussie battler born with the curse of incredible beauty. Thanks, Paulie. He is starting a podcast series on Aussies abroad that are crushing it. Naturally, I thought of you. Trav, meet Paddy Steinfort. Paddy is one of the most humble and balanced minds I have met in the elite sports space. He has not followed a conventional path, and it's really worked for him. Such an inspirational story. Played more games of AFL than you, that's right, and will make you feel even shorter than you are. I'm sure you'll have a great conversation.
Good setup. Thanks, Paul, for the kind words.
Beautiful setup.
Actual fact check, though. I technically is correct because 0 is greater than 0.
Yes.
But I hold the record for the longest time in a team without playing a game.
There you go.
Yeah. A single team, 5 years and couldn't get on the park.
No games.
That was a tough little stretch of my life.
I bet.
But if that's the worst thing that happens, then
so be it.
Have a crack.
Yep. Love it. Thanks, Paddy. Legend, mate.
Been a pleasure.
Thank you.